It's great to be here this morning, and I'm really excited, and it's really nice to hear a real focus on wellness this morning, so I appreciate that. And what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about the notion of stress and how we actually build a more of a culture of wellness with the work that we do. So I'm just curious, by show of hands, how many people routinely experience some stress in the workplace? Anybody? Okay. How many people know other folks who experience some stress in the work? Okay, so stress is a pervasive thing in our lives. It's really important. Now, I'm just curious, actually, before I dive into this, how many of you would like to experience more moments of joy or satisfaction or happiness? Yeah, okay. So in order to be able to do that, you got to understand psychologically and motivationally what stress is and what happiness and joy and satisfaction are. Because without that, you actually can't begin to build the culture you want. So let's dig into this. Let's start with the brain for a moment and the human motivational system. So your motivational system is a set of brain mechanisms that enable you to achieve your goals. Okay? And we have two kinds of goals that we routinely try to achieve. Some of those goals involve beautiful, wonderful, desirable things out there in the world that we're trying to go after. So it might be that we want to have a great conversation with a colleague, or we want to go out and have a lovely meal, or on weekends when UT is playing, we're excited to see UT, maybe they're going to win a game this week, right? So we have beautiful, wonderful, desirable things that we go after, and we call those approach goals because we try to approach those things. And then there are what are called avoidance goals. And avoidance goals are those noxious, dangerous calamities or threats in our world that we're trying to avoid, trying to prevent from coming about. So, that could be, avoiding ourselves getting ill, avoiding a negative outcome with a patient, avoiding a negative outcome with a client, right? These are all things, with a colleague. So we may very well be trying to avoid some catastrophe, some calamity, some threat, and that engages our avoidance motivation because we're trying to get away from this. Okay, so we've got approach motivation, avoidance motivation. Now we got to dig into the brain a little bit. So think back. If you're not in looking at the brain regularly, I want you to think back to your studies and remember that the brain looks like a pair of boxing gloves set the wrong way around, right? Thumbs on the outside, it's bumpy. Just to remember your terminology here, right? It's gray in color on the outside, which is what we call gray matter, thank you. Those are bare neurons densely packed at the surface of the brain, and that outer cortex is what enables us to do all sorts of nifty kinds of information processing, whether it's visual processing in the back of the brain or some of the more decision making and storytelling abilities that we may have in some of our frontal cortex. Dig into the brain, it goes from gray in color to white in color fairly quickly. We call that stuff white matter, thank you. That white matter is largely, or the reason it's white is because there's a lot of insulation around nerve fibers, and that's because just like if you opened up a piece of stereo equipment or other electronic equipment, you've got circuit boards and you've got wiring harnesses that will carry electricity from one board to another. Similarly, inside the brain, you've got essentially wiring harnesses that are carrying electrical signals from one area of the brain to another. And just like in that piece of stereo equipment, we insulate those the wires. The only difference between the brain and the stereo equipment is that nobody expects anyone to go looking at the wires, so we don't need to color code them, so they're all white. Continue digging into the brain, and eventually, deep inside the brain, we come to the basal ganglia. Those are more gray matter structures deep inside the brain. If you were to dissect the brain of a rat or a sheep or a mouse, so creatures that we diverged from evolutionarily, a long, long time ago, you still find those structures inside the brain. Where the brains of those animals differ from those of humans is in the differentiation of the cortex, which is what gives us the really nifty storytelling apparatus that we have. But those structures deep in the brain are responsible for a lot of the kinds of things that all animals have to do, including motivation. And so that motivation to achieve whatever goals you have, depending on what kind of creature you are running through circuits that involve those basal ganglia. And the reason that I'm telling you this whole story is because those structures are old evolutionarily and consequently not particularly well connected to the rest of that cortex, particularly not that well connected to all that storytelling apparatus that we have, which is why if I ask you, why did you do that? You tell me a story, but at some point you realize you're telling me a story. Like, I'm not sure, but I have to think about it. In fact, the reason that therapy is a thing is because of this structure of the brain. If I could have complete access to my motivational system, if my storytelling apparatus could look transparently at what I was doing, I wouldn't need therapy. I just need a dark room to sit in for a while and introspect. But because there isn't this great connectivity, instead I need trained professionals to sit down with me and work through, why in the world am I doing what I'm doing? Because I don't really know. Now that doesn't mean that my motivational system doesn't communicate at all with the rest of my brain. What it means is it doesn't really give me good introspective access. Instead, what the motivational system does is it creates feelings. And so when you have a feeling of some kind, chances are that is a reflection of your current motivation. Those feelings have two dimensions to them. We call them valence and arousal. Valence, good, bad. Arousal, strong, weak. Okay? The valence is, if I'm doing well motivationally, if I'm generally speaking achieving a goal I have, I feel pretty good. And if I'm not achieving a goal that I have, I feel bad. Good, bad. Motivationally, if things are going well, I feel good. If they're going badly, I feel bad. And the more invested I am in this, the stronger the feeling. And of course, we learn to read that off of people. It's the reason why when you're talking to somebody about something you're really excited about, and it might be a TV show, it might be a sporting event, whatever it is, and you say, isn't that amazing? And the person you're talking to goes, yeah. And the reason the reason that you immediately pick up that they're not as motivationally engaged in this as you are is because the reaction they're having, that feeling that they're having, isn't as strong as the one you're having, which means they're not as invested in this as you are. And that's why then you're like, okay, you know what, I'm boring you, I'll stop, because you know that they're not as engaged. Okay, so your motivational system creates these feelings, and I promise I'm getting to the point here. Those feelings then have to be interpreted into emotions. We go through a process that psychologists call appraisal, where we look at the world around us and we try to figure out, why am I feeling this way? And we play a bit of a guessing game, and we use that to determine the emotion that we're experiencing. And most of the time, we get the story reasonably right. If we have time later, I'll talk about some fun situations in which we get it wrong. But most of the time, we get it mostly right. And so what we do is we figure out, I must be experiencing this emotion because I'm feeling this way in this situation. And now we get to the crux of this. If I am engaged in avoiding a threat or a calamity, I experience one of two types of emotions, depending on how I'm doing. If I am not yet successfully avoiding the threat or the calamity, I experience stress, fear, and anxiety because there's some threat out there in the world, something noxious that could happen, and I haven't escaped it yet, and so I'm fearful of it, or I'm stressed about it, or I'm anxious about it. And in the event that I successfully avoid the threat or the catastrophe, I experience relief. I made it. Okay? Stress and relief are the emotions we experience when the motivations that we're engaged in are primarily avoidance motivations. When we characterize our world in terms of threats and calamities and catastrophes, we experience stress, punctuated by occasional bouts of relief. So where's happiness in that equation? It's not. Happiness occurs when there's some beautiful, wonderful, desirable thing in the world. I've got some approach, goal that I am engaged in. So let's imagine, that UT is playing, and being a professor at the University of Texas, I want to see the football team win their games. And when they win the game, I experience happiness and joy. And when they lose the game, I experience sadness, dejection. Okay? So happy, sad, those are the emotions you experience when you are engaging in approach motivation. Why does this matter? Because all of you raised your hands and said you experience routinely stress or anxiety in the workplace. You'd like to experience more moments of happiness and joy and satisfaction. That is one of the things that is really making it hard right now for people to stay engaged in the work that they're doing, because stress is physically painful. Right? We want to avoid stress. It is a painful emotion to experience, and most of us do not think to ourselves, my goal at the end of the week is just to be relieved. We, in fact, end up medicating ourselves often because of the pain associated with stress. Bars have this thing that they call happy hour. That is not happy hour. That is relief hour. I made it through another day, and I'm going to dull some stuff for an hour or two before I go home so that I can live to fight another day and fight off the threats and calamities that are around me. How can I experience then some happiness and satisfaction? Well, what I have to do is to remember that at least every once in a while, I have to find ways to characterize my work life, not just in terms of the avoidance of catastrophe and threat, but also in terms of the beautiful, wonderful, desirable outcomes that I can create. Now, that's not the case that everything needs to be framed in terms of beauty and wonder and joy and happiness. There are threats and catastrophes out there. There are bad things that happen that need to be avoided. You may have noticed I'm walking around with a cane right now. I didn't come, equipped with this initially, but 3.5 months ago, I had a pretty nasty cycling accident and shattered my pelvis, and now I've got a nice metal plate that thankfully doesn't set off the metal detector at the airport, and so I'm recovering from that. But, the recovery, getting injured was something I was trying to avoid. That was, was good. And there was a lot of the early phase of recovery from the accident involved trying to avoid bad outcomes. So there are definitely times where avoidance motivation is entirely appropriate and proper. The question is, do we have to frame everything we're doing in terms of avoidance? And the answer is no. There are lots of opportunities that we have to decide how we want to frame something. Do I want to spend my day, if I'm running a little bit late, thinking I've got to avoid running late, I'm going to upset somebody. I got to make sure that nobody gets upset because the schedule's behind. Or can I try to find some moments of connection with people, some moments in which there is some beautiful, wonderful, desirable outcome that I can create? I need to find ways to do that myself, and I need to find ways to infuse that in the kinds of conversations that I have. One of the things that I've been recommending is when you get together for a group meeting. Here you are all gathered today, and these are colleagues of yours broadly construed, but let's say you get together with folks in your practice and you have a meeting. There's a nice thing you can do that's by analogy to something that they do in the construction industry. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a construction industry meeting. I also speak to construction industry groups often. When the construction industry gets together for a meeting, no matter where they are, they start that meeting with a safety moment. They talk about something related to safety. And even if you're sitting in a cushy hotel room somewhere, they'll point out where the defibrillators are, or the exits or the fire extinguishers. And the reason that they do that is because in the construction industry, safety needs to be top of mind for everyone, because an accident on a job site could lead to a fatality, and that's something you're trying to avoid. So they remind everybody all the time, you need to be focused on safety. I believe in the medical profession, it is important to try to start meetings with what I'm calling a joy moment. Like, have everybody go around and have somebody find something beautiful, wonderful, or desirable that has happened in their work life in the recent past that they can share with everyone. And I'm going to ask you to do this in a second. I'm going to ask somebody to share a joy moment. But before that, I'm going to tell a story about the very first time that I suggested this. I was doing a CME event at a hospital, and I put this idea out there, and I just said, "Can anyone come up with a joy moment?" Because everyone, people were really stressed, and people looked around for a while, and finally, an administrator at the hospital said, "Well, you know what? The hospital had been under investigation for a potential infraction, and we found out this morning that in fact we aren't liable for this." I said, "Yeah, that's a relief moment, okay? You have avoided a catastrophe. Congratulations, but try again." And then people they do what you do when you can't think of something, they're staring up at the ceiling. And finally somebody said, a 5-year-old came back onto the ward. He had been sick, and he came back and he brought lollipops to thank us. I said, "Yeah, you see, 5-year-olds with lollipops, that's a joy moment, okay? The not being under investigation anymore, you go to happy hour for that." So just curious, does anybody have a joy moment that they can share with us now? Yes?
I have one of my patients that's now 17 and a senior that I've seen since she was a newborn is shadowing me. And I went into a room this week with another patient whose kid was 14. It's been my patient since he was a baby. And the mom said that, "Oh, you are so lucky to be following the best doctor there ever is." Of course, they only know me, but that was very sweet.
Yeah, exactly, right? So collect those moments, share those moments. It's really important for us to remind ourselves why we do this sort of thing. There's a lot. Yeah, you got one too. This is great.
I had a patient, a lady who comes to see me every year for her checkup. And she came in this year for her checkup, and she brought a box of chocolates for me. And she said, "Dr. Brown, I can tell you were really stressed when I saw you last year. I hope this year is better for you. I brought you some chocolates, and I hid it in a bag because I want you to keep it. I don't want you to share it with those people at the front that were mean to me."
There you go. No, exactly, right? Yeah, did you have one? That's good.
I had several patients yesterday that were in crisis. We went over our scheduled time so I could get home till 9 o'clock at night. And I'm looking at my phone, and I get 3 calls of patients who somehow found a way to text me on my personal phone. So I called them, and I was in a place that could have been better. But by the end of those 3 conversations, I had made such a profound difference in being able to connect to them. There's been a shortage of medications in our specialty, and people are in a state of perpetual panic. And they were calm, and they were settled, and they were at peace with themselves, and I'd given them options and choices that we could address. And I had a sense of that peace for myself.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? What's interesting about that is it's a very positive moment, but there's a sense in which that peace is actually a relief moment. It's a profound relief moment, but it's a relief moment, right? There was a potential crisis here, and I made a difference. Now, hopefully, the next time that you see some of those patients, they will also express gratitude, appreciation, talk about the benefits that had for them, which can actually then begin to flip that into an experience of the real, so you had the kind of satisfaction you experienced, and it's definitely a satisfaction, is a relief kind of satisfaction. You helped a bunch of people to avoid a crisis. And it is important, by the way, to celebrate those moments also, because we do need to celebrate the victories. But we also need to find, and some of this involves asking people sometimes for the ways in which the treatments that we provide actually create the space for them to experience more joy, right? I mean, one of the things is, in many ways, your job is in many cases to fix the thing that's broken. But you fix the thing that's broken in order to create those opportunities for your patients to have the joyful times that they're going to have. And experiencing those through them can be a powerful thing and a valuable thing to do. Now, that's one thing you can do, right? One thing you can do is to begin to find ways to reframe the work that you do to find more of the beautiful, wonderful, desirable things. However, you also have to recognize that that is not always an option in the moment. In the moment, there are going to be times where you've been running late all day and there are medication shortages and there are other problems that are legitimately out there. In those moments, there also need to be good ways to address the stress that you're dealing with. And here's where there's a fascinating, another fascinating element. So I mentioned I had this cycling accident, I had surgery, I spent a week in the hospital, and I was really pleased to discover, I had a physician who came to see me about the second morning that I was there, and she asked me, how was I doing? I said, I'm kind of down today. I was, because when you have an injury, you sort of ride the day-to-day and not the trajectory. And so I'd had a pretty good day, and then I had a bad day after that, and so I was like, oh, this is never going to get over this, right? And so I said, well, I'm having a bad day. And immediately she began to list for me all of the different mental health resources that were available that I could engage with. And I was so thrilled to hear that, because I feel like that has not always been the case, right? And so I explained I'm a psychologist. I have a pretty good support network. I know what I'm trying to accomplish here, and I'm going to be okay by this afternoon. I'm just feeling down this morning. But thank you, right? I just started by saying thank you for doing this, because it's so important to make these resources available. The thing is, we're making these resources available to our patients, and we're not making them available to ourselves. And we are not recommending those to each other. And we need to, right? There are times where it does get to be a little bit too much, where there's just stress every day, and you need somebody to talk to. And my clinical psychology colleagues, one of the things, they all have somebody that they talk to every week, because when you're carrying other people's problems around all week, you need someone that you can talk to in order to make sure that you have a space for yourself to express what you need to express, and to get feedback from somebody else about the way that you might be carrying that. It's really important. So it's important to find colleagues that you can talk to, not just about difficult patients, but about yourself and how you're doing. And you should be reaching out to colleagues and not just saying, hey, how you doing? Which is, I grew up in New Jersey, so I used to say, hey, how you doing? But you don't care how they're doing. That's just a way of saying hi, right? And then somebody's supposed to say, fine, and then you walk on. But actually, what if you said to somebody, no, how are you doing? I mean, tell me. Let's actually sit. Let's have a cup of coffee or decaf or tea, and just sit and talk. How are you doing? Right? We need that. We need those moments of connection with people. We need to be able to express how we're doing, And if you find that you've got a colleague who is having trouble with the level of stress, you'd like to help them to find resources before they burn out on that, before they self-medicate. Because that's common. We need to have that engagement. We need to point our colleagues to those resources just as much as we are now pointing patients to those resources. We need to help people to deal with the stress. And we also need to take time for ourselves. I appreciated this idea of, slowing down and engaging. Exercising is good. Going out for a walk, seeing the sun. We're very quickly going to come. We're going to set the clocks back tonight, and as a result of setting the clocks back, it's still going to be a little dark when you get up, and now it's going to be dark when you leave work. And at some point, you're just going to feel like I live a life of darkness. Make sure you get outside and see the sun and remind yourself that there is light out there. Right? Engage. Find some time to talk to your colleagues. Create space. Because without that, you lose resilience. And let's face it, we are coming off of several really hard years. Okay? I mean, March of 2020 hit, and everything changed, and it hasn't quite changed back yet for the medical profession. Lots of other areas of the world feel like things are totally normal, and we're at least sitting in a room and not everyone is masked, which is a big change from where we were. A couple of years ago, we couldn't even get together in a room. Now we're able to see live, three-dimensional human beings, which is a wonderful thing. But we have to really remember that there's still a lot of work. There's backlogs. There's supply chain problems. And people are exhausted and have not really had a chance to relax and to recharge. Our resilience levels are low. And so we have to find ways to lower the energy a little bit. So one other thing I want to talk about here is, one of the things that can happen is we tend to mirror the people that we engage with. So next time you go to a coffee shop or a restaurant, if you're there by yourself, sit and watch all the other people having conversations. And what you will find is that all the pairs of people who are talking have found a way to mirror each other. There's going to be some groups of people that are leaning over the table and they're both like this having a conversation, and there are others who are leaning back and they're, But whatever it is, each person in the conversation is adopting the same engagement, right? And it's different for the various pairs of people around the room. And once you notice that, you begin to realize that the same thing happens in the conversations you have. That when you're talking with a colleague who's stressed, it's natural to begin to adopt some of the same kinds of mannerisms, to kind of clench up and to begin to act in the same way. After a while, you discover you're just as stressed as the person you just talked to. Because if you think about it, these reactions, these emotional reactions that emerge from our motivational systems, they come along with bodily engagement, right? When you experience stress, then you've engaged that avoidance motivational system, which tends, if it's serious enough, to also engage the sympathetic nervous system, which means we get that fight or flight response. And fight and flight were brilliant on the African savanna 150,000 years ago when the stressors were things we had to run away from or fight. Most of the stressors now are people and systems and electronic medical records. And fighting those doesn't help much, right? I've tried it. Hitting a computer, it hurts your knuckles and it can be expensive, okay? But it doesn't solve the problem. And so the physiological responses that we create are not good responses for the modern workplace. And so part of what happens is if we begin to mirror the people that we're dealing with, and we take on that attitude of stress, it actually results in our adopting the stress of the people around us. So what we have to do is to break that cycle. Use the finely differentiated frontal lobes we have to separate yourself psychologically from the situation for a moment, to recognize that you're going down a path that can lead to stress, and then explicitly adopt bodily behaviors that are incompatible with stress. So, for example, deep breathing, right? So if you think about stress, what do? You breathe good shallow breaths, get a lot of oxygen in so that you can fight or run, okay? But deep breathing, why does that work, right? Why, if you do a meditation, if you've ever done anybody ever do a meditation, anybody? A couple of you, yeah. You can admit it. It's a safe space here. Try it. The first thing that they do in a meditation, when I was in the hospital trying to sleep, I did meditations. It was amazing. It was. I mean, I'd done a few before, but I was in pain, and it was wonderful. And part of what it did, part of what you do when you start those meditations is you just, and you know what? Do that 5 times and you feel differently. And the reason you feel differently is because that bodily movement is actually incompatible with that stress response. And so you can actually build some of this from the outside in, right? Not everything has to come from the inside out. You can do some things from the outside in. So here you are engaged in that conversation with somebody. They're all stressed out. You're getting into it with them. Take that psychological break. Lean back. Breathe. And you know what? They may do the same thing, right? They may lean back a little bit. They may breathe a little bit more slowly, a little bit more deeply. And so you can create the energy that is a better energy for that situation if you bring that awareness to the situation, if you recognize that you can also contribute to the situation. Right? So we want to make sure that both for ourselves when we're overly stressed, as well as with others, that we find ways to calm situations down, to make sure that we do get out and move a little bit, that we do things that are incompatible with being really, really stressed. Because the thing about stress is it's not going to help us to do our jobs. Stress has a number of influences. It narrows your working memory capacity, which means you can hold less information in mind. The danger of narrowing your working memory capacity is you're supposed to be thinking. And you can't think particularly effectively if you can't keep much information in mind at the same time. It also tends to narrow you down to a limited set of possibilities. So if you're engaging in any kind of diagnostic procedure, you're not thinking about as many different possibilities because you become a little bit more focused on things. So by calming that energy down, by changing that energy, what you're doing is you're opening yourself up to being in a better psychological state to actually do the work that you do. And then the last thing I want to say, and then I do want to throw it open for questions, because this is the kind of topic where I think a lot of people are experiencing a variety of things, and I love to hear what kinds of issues people are grappling with. But the last thing that I want to talk about is that as we think about our reactions to things, I also want to encourage you to be willing to truly experience the full range of emotions that are involved in the work that you do. So the emotional toolbox we have is a reflection of our motivational toolbox. And because we can change the way we're motivated from the outside in addition to the inside out, we can end up removing tools from our toolbox when we believe that there are emotions that we are not supposed to experience. So if I say I'm not allowed to be sad about a bad outcome, then what I'm doing is actually driving myself away from, interestingly, away from approach motivation. Remember, happy and sad are approach axis emotions. If you have a patient you cared about and that patient dies, if you don't allow yourself to feel sad, then what you're doing is saying, there was a beautiful, wonderful, desirable thing, a life that was celebrated, and that person died, what you end up doing when you don't experience that sadness is you actually often drive yourself towards avoidance. You start thinking about, what are all the things I could have done that would have staved off a calamity, as opposed to celebrating the life of a patient who died. And allowing yourself to live in the approach motivational axis, even when there's a bad outcome. And I'll just tell a quick story about this, that from my own life. My younger brother died of Crohn's disease at 33. He let it get out of control. He was tired of the medication. He got himself down. He was about 5'10". He got himself down to 105 pounds. Ended up in the hospital. Was in the hospital for 4 months. They worked really valiantly. His team worked really valiantly, but he ultimately died. He was friends with everyone. You would talk with him, and immediately, you had a connection with him. His entire medical team loved him, and on the night that he died at about 4 a.m, and my parents and I were in the hospital in the ICU waiting room, and his doctors both came down, and the 5 of us, my parents, me, and these 2 doctors, stood around in a big group hug crying for about 10 minutes. And then we thanked them and they went away. And it was a beautiful moment. Now, you can't do that with everybody. I understand that. But the beauty of that was the recognition that this was actually a moment in which we could live in that space of loss, but again, on that approach space of loss. A beautiful human being had died, and we lived in that moment. We didn't avoid that emotion and drive ourselves towards some other motivational way of dealing with this. Now, again, you can't always do that with the family. You got to know the relationship. But if you are feeling that as a loss, allowing yourself to experience that in a context that's right, whether it's with a colleague or with a family member or with a therapist or with a clergy person, finding the way to have that experience and allow yourself that part of the emotional toolbox is incredibly healthy, because it allows us to experience that full range. And when we allow ourselves to feel sad, we have actually opened up more opportunities to be happy and joyful and satisfied with the work that we do. So just to summarize where we went today, okay, your motivational system, it's got these 2 modes. It's got approach and avoidance, okay? We live routinely in our work lives in an avoidance mode in which there are threats and calamities and catastrophes that we're trying to avoid, and that leads to a cycle of stress and relief. Every once in a while, we have to open ourselves up to the beautiful, wonderful, desirable things that engage our approach motivation, that give us opportunities to experience joy and happiness and satisfaction with the work that we do. We need to do that as individuals. We need to build a culture that is willing to do that. And we need to be sensitive to what's going on emotionally and motivationally with our colleagues if we're going to get through the next several years and emerge from this era, the post-pandemic era. If we're going to emerge from that healthy as individuals in a profession, we're going to do that by embracing a culture in which we are sensitive to what's going on with our colleagues. So thanks for listening to me, but I'd love to take your questions and hear what you have to say.